Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I looked at the slides that are already posted online, and my last slide seems to have been cut off. So I'm going to start by saying it's actually just an acknowledgement slide. So I'm going to start just by acknowledging that the funding for this research comes from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada through their Insight funding stream, and that this work is something that I've been doing over the last 2 years with Dr. Kelly Bronson, who's a science and technology studies scholar at the University of Ottawa. So we've been collaborating on this for about the last 2 years, really when we started to realize that there wasn't a lot of attention paid in our fields, that we're both paying a lot of attention to communication technologies, information technologies, how science and technology interact with society and social issues, but there's very little attention paid to how that whole field interacted with food and food systems and their impacts on human and environmental health. So I'm going to spend about the first half of my talk trying to give you a bit of more idea of the context in which all of this concern that we have around big data in agriculture is happening. So that contextual information will give you a sense of what we're looking at. It's a bit of a moving target. We started out 2 years ago saying, let's do an environmental scan and see what's happening in terms of technology, specifically big data technologies in precision agriculture, and let's see what the landscape is. And we found it to be a very complex moving target. So I'll give you a taste of what's really happening there, and then I'll try to really point out to some of the concerns we have, which I think will echo a lot of the things we've already heard yesterday afternoon and this morning as well, and suggest some recommendations, some of the ways that we can think about these things differently. As you probably, if you looked at the abstract of my talk, what I'm really concerned with is how data-driven smart farming offers these promises about revolutionizing agriculture, and how big agri-conglomerates have been moving into this field and collecting these immense amounts of proprietary data that is fundamental to how we manage food systems. And they're raising a whole multitude of new questions. So what I want to give you an idea of is that this is all happening in this context of what we call the industrial food system. So food system scholars talk about the industrial food system as something that has been happening for about the last century, where food is really treated just as a commodity. I know we're in Chicago, so this is where a lot of grain trading happens. This is where so much agricultural trading is happening. So you might take it for granted that food is just a commodity. But as David Marshall was hinting yesterday, there are a lot of things that we think about in the public domain differently than we do when we treat them as a commodity. And this industrial food system has focused over the last 100 years on food not as a multifunctional activity, which a lot of European understanding of agriculture does. But in North America, we focus on food as a commodity. So we focus on efficiency and yields, and we have that developing over the last century with two key developments. And these two key developments are concentration of power and technosolutionism. And that has then fed into some of these other developments that I'm going to talk about in a second. So the first one, the concentration of power, we have about 70% of the world's food actually produced by small farmers. But most of the decision-making and policy-making around the world on national and international scales is actually influenced by large industrial conglomerates that have a lot more influence than these 70% of food produced by a multitude of farmers, small-scale farmers generally, often in non-industrialized countries. About half of them are women, and those decision processes are also influenced by something that food studies scholars have described as this hourglass of food economy. So we have these millions of food producers around the world and billions of consumers, but how that food gets from producers to consumers is really controlled by a handful of very, very influential entities, typically international entities. And these are the entities that control production, land, distribution of food, and increasingly are influencing policy at all levels. And the result of this concentration isn't always easy to recognize either, because what we find is that many of the brands that actually exist in the food system are often owned by the same company, same conglomerate. So you will have multiple brands all under the same umbrella. And how this plays out is something that Phil Howard from Michigan State University has been mapping out for the last bunch of years. So he's looked at things like concentration of wheat and bread, beer industry, a variety of different things. But this is one of the key maps, and it's now getting a little out of date because this is from 2013. It's okay if you can't read what it says. What's important to focus on is to look at these big red circles that are dominating the map. And what this is the map of the seed industry structure around the globe. And it points out to companies that are dominating the landscape of seed industry right now. And the map is out of date now, 5 years later, because actually two of the companies at the bottom, so Dow and DuPont, have become Dow-DuPont, so they're one company now. Up at the top, Monsanto and Bayer have just been approved to merge. It's being called a takeover by Bayer, but it's really a merger of Monsanto and Bayer. And then the fifth big red circle that you see at the bottom left corner is Syngenta, and Syngenta has effectively been taken over by ChemChina now. So what we see is that concentration is increasing even more. And these are also the companies that are not just dominating the seed market, they're also dominating the markets for all kinds of farm inputs. So agrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, all of those things. So it's this kind of layered concentration. Another thing that's happening within this, too, is that these companies have been, particularly since World War II and what is known as the Green Revolution, focusing on technologies and how technology can solve all of the problems around the food system. And this idea in science and technology studies is known as technosolutionism, where we actually look at challenges we face as individuals, communities, and society and say, well, we can solve this with better technologies. But the problem in the food system, and I would argue in a lot of other social issues, is that these issues have social causes. If we look at the continued existence of hunger and malnutrition around the world, we find that they're a result of social inequalities, inability of people to access land where they can produce and harvest their own food, and also conflict areas. So these are all social causes to hunger and malnutrition. But we keep trying to come up with technologies that can solve these challenges without really ever addressing the social and political problems that lie at the root of it. So technosolutionism is something that, as critical social scientists, we really try to challenge quite a bit. And Michael Carleton, who's actually, I would say, the only person who has been really delving in depth into some of the issues that we're talking about here, he's a sociologist here in the States, has been trying to get at the bottom of this. So if you're interested more into that, I recommend his work. And of course, these two developments have also produced one of the things that I think creates the basis of what I want to talk about today that is of interest to you, and that is the growing privatization of agri-food research. Now, agricultural research and food development research tended to be in the public hands right up until about 1950s, 1960s. And since then, what we've seen is that this research is increasingly in the private hands. Devlin Kayak has mapped out how this has played out in Canada, where up until the 1960s, virtually all of the agricultural research was done by the Canadian government or through Canadian government funding given to researchers at universities or research center, agricultural research centers and experimental farms. And since the 1960s, what we've seen is that private companies have moved into agricultural research and become to dominate not only research that's done under their umbrella, but also research that is influenced by their needs through providing funding to public universities. So this presence of privatization of research is really significant. Molly Anderson at Middlebury College says that in the United States, between just 2008 and 2013, so this is a 5-year period, if we look at inflation-adjusted funding for public food and agricultural research, we see that it dropped by 20% in 5 years. This is during the Obama administration, too, by the way. I think it's quite notable. So we'll see, it remains to be seen what's going to happen now. But that private research in this area actually increased by 64%, and this is inflation-adjusted. So we can see how private data, private information in agriculture and food is playing a more important role increasingly. So what this has happened to is that our global obsession with data technologies, which we've heard about quite a bit over the last 12 hours or so, oh no, longer than that, but 24 hours, let's say, it's really arrived now in the agricultural and food sector. So we see, the president of Climate Corporation, which I'll talk about in a minute again, which designs digital devices for the collection and analysis of agricultural data, actually predicts that we are now entering this data-driven farm of the future. And Paul Turner, the CEO of mobile management platform AgDNA, which will also be mentioned later in my presentation again, says that our algorithms can help farmers feed the world. So this idea of techno-solutionism, again, that we can take a social issue and address it through better technologies. What we see is that these big data digital tools are entering in the realm of farm equipment, are really starting to play an increasing role in the trading of agricultural commodities and futures. And I'll touch on that again, and also in the agrochemical industry. So what we see is that somebody like Archer Daniel Midland, this is one of the central companies that plays a massive role in agricultural trading. It forms one of the 4 companies that Phil Howard describes as ABCD companies, which dominate the global trade. These are ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. In the recent years, they have actually entered financial markets with commodity and investment funds, so stimulating this investment in commodity futures in the agricultural sector. And earlier this year, they announced their intention to take over Bunge Trading Company, so one of the 4 companies that dominate the global grain market. So increasing concentration even further, but then at the same time, they also launched FarmView, and it's an app that collects and provides commodity prices and elevator announcements to farmers, but it also brokers shipping, storage, and contracts. And so you can imagine how much a company like ADM that will now absorb Bunge, how much power and control a company like that can have when they have all this information at their hands. So this is one of the sort of illustrations just of what is happening in this sector. We also see that other giants in the food sector are similarly growing their power through entering the data markets. So Dow, DuPont, and Syngenta started buying up software companies. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. So DuPont acquired ag software company Granular. Syngenta acquired Ag Connections. So Syngenta, remember again that they're still Syngenta, but they're being absorbed by ChemChina. We're in the process of seeing that because Ag China managed to buy about 98% of the shares. So what we see here is that they're not only entering the data markets, but they're buying up existing software companies that have already been playing in this sector. John Deere covers a range of digital tools, and they now have access to unprecedented detail at the farm level. So we heard, I really liked that comment about data imperialism, and I think we're really seeing that in agricultural sector, is that what we're seeing is that this really kind of granular, specific data that refers to individual farms even is at the hands of these big corporations, and there are serious concerns around that. They also acquired AgDNA, which I mentioned earlier. They will help farmers feed the world. It's a big promise. Remains to be seen if any of that pans out. Monsanto has also been in the business of buying up tech firms. So I mentioned Climate Corp earlier. Climate Corp has now been absorbed by Monsanto, and so Climate FieldView is one of their main products. It's a whole suite of agricultural data apps and tools that farmers can use if they buy into this package. And they've also acquired Precision Planting, which is now a part of Monsanto. So these are just some of the sort of issues that we're seeing, or trends that we're seeing in the sector. And now John Deere and Climate Corporations are starting to share information. So John Deere, the technology tractor company and equipment company, is partnering up with Monsanto, seed and agricultural chemical company, and they're sharing information. So you can see how this gets more and more complicated. And these are just some of the examples that we've actually been able to observe. So Canadian Broadcasting Company recently reported that Canadian PR firm was recruiting scientists to participate in an online UN forum on gene editing. And Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has paid $1.6 million US to Emerging Ag Inc. It's a PR company in Canada that received this money to, over the next 3 years, manage the scientist network So the idea is that they will feed information to scientists, encourage them to participate in this UN forum, and basically covertly influence agricultural policy at the international level. So gene editing, it doesn't refer just to agricultural policy, but it will have very significant implications to agricultural policy. And I don't want to get into the details of that, but I can talk more about it afterwards if anybody wants to know more about that. And so all of this is then happening also in this larger context of financialization. So I mentioned commodities and futures trading and how all of this is playing out in the ag and food system. And this context of financialization is actually something that food studies scholars are increasingly concerned about. So it's a trend that we're seeing in agriculture really in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, where financial companies were starting to look for new ways to invest in places that promise returns. And we've seen investment companies enter agricultural markets in unprecedented ways and at unprecedented scales. And scholars like Philip McMichael here in the US and on the Canadian side, Jennifer Clapp and Annette Desmarais have been studying these trends, indicating that the domination of financial motives and principles in the sector is increasing speculation, is increasing so-called land grabs, which is where we're seeing investment funds, pension funds, and even international governments buying larger and larger swaths of agricultural land as investment, not to produce food now, but maybe in the future or turn it around and sell it. And they're inviting traditional investment products, such as pension plans now, into these ag markets. Now, when we make agri-food a key component of the financial markets, what we're really doing is bringing a whole set of values that dominates financial markets into our agri-food system. And David Marshall talked about this yesterday, about how, even when I'm a communication studies scholar, right, so I get caught up on language and words sometimes, but when we talk about data supply chain, what we're really doing is basically suggesting that we're thinking about data as a commodity. So this is a similar idea. When we talk about food as a commodity, as an investment, as something that should be a part of the financial markets, we're actually bringing in a whole set of values that will then determine what we do in this sector. And recently, and it's not related directly to food, but I think it's really worthwhile pondering on, Goldman Sachs analysis of gene therapy report that just recently came out had a particular note that said, and I quote here, "The potential to deliver one-shot cures is one of the most attractive aspects of gene therapy, genetically engineered cell therapy, and gene editing." The analysts wrote further, and I quote again, "While this proposition carries tremendous value for patients and society, it could represent a challenge for genome medicine developers looking for sustained cash flow," end quote. So think about this. If this is the set of values we're bringing to the agricultural sector, and if the idea of investing in this sector and the technologies that come with it is to continue making money, can we trust this sector to actually come up with solutions, or are they really just in the business of finding a steady cash flow? And so this is what I find, as a critical social scientist, what I find really alarming in many ways. And we're also seeing now, great to bring you back to data, we're seeing great parallels between land grabs and data grabs, and this is in terms of which companies are playing a role, but also how we're doing with this. And TechCrunch New Frontier TechCrunch described this as the new frontier, and geographer Alistair Fraser said that land grabs and data grabs are actually bound up together, where we're seeing companies buying up and collecting large swaths of agricultural data to sell. So I'm going to try and go through some of the social implications. I have done what is totally inappropriate for slides and included long quotes, but I did that because I wanted to have that available online for everybody. So the issues around here are around opting out. So we heard about this quite a bit, about having a choice. Privacy, so will farmers actually be identified in this? And what will happen to their data? Who is actually their data being sold to? As David Marshall talked about yesterday, are farmers actually consumers here, or are they the product that is being sold if their data is being collected through these systems? Transparency, what data is collected and for what purpose, who has access to it, that's another thing. Cultural appropriateness, we see a lot of concerns around What will this do to Indigenous communities, for instance? In Canada, this is a big concern. If this is where government is heading with their investments and what they're encouraging is innovation, what will this mean to everybody? What farmers are saying, this is from Monsanto. If you look at this, I included this not for identity politics purposes, but just to point out what Monsanto sees as farmers. This is not what farmers look like. This is what some farmers look like. 50% of farmers are women, and a majority of farmers in the world are not in industrialized countries. So I think this is a really important thing to think about when we think about cultural appropriateness. So implications for you, and I was going to talk a bit about private-public partnerships, but I'll skip that to just get to some of the implications that I think might be important to you. Data generation, we don't collect data, we generate data. Data aren't something that just out there and we go and collect. Data are generated through the processes of what kinds of questions we're asking, what kind of research questions we ask, how do we go about gathering information, how we interpret information. And depending on what questions we ask, we're also leaving a bunch of questions out. So equally important is what do we leave out through data generation? And when the private sector is dominating data generation, what happens with the questions that should be asked in the public interest? Access to data, without questions of ownership and access to data, will public repositories of knowledge become less relevant? And I think this is a key concern if we think about policy development in particular. So how can researchers meaningfully contribute to policy development if the majority of data generated in the sector is in the hands of big data, big agri? So what is the relevance of us as researchers and librarians and archivists? How can we actually, in an informed way, contribute to policy development if we don't have any access or control over what data is being produced? I've included a bunch of quotes from many of the interviews we've done over the last couple of years, so I'm just going to leave those on the screen for a few seconds. I know you can't read all of them really quickly, but they're online, so if you want to download my slides, you can see what many of the people are saying. What I want to get to just in the last couple of minutes that I have left is the couple of recommendations regarding the social and environmental innovation, opt-in technologies, and algorithmic transparency. So with a lot of this, what we're talking about here is, I mentioned earlier private-public partnerships and how governments are really kind of jumping on the bandwagon. We're seeing this a lot in Canada. So, recently Agriculture Canada partnered up with the McCain's, which are one of the largest potato and French fries producers in the world. And they're doing all this drone technology research with them. And they're like, really excited about this. And I mean, governments should be supporting innovation, it should be supporting technology development, but what we're seeing is that Canadian government in particular has really touted innovation as one of the sort of goals of the current administration. And what they talk about when they talk about innovation is really technological innovation. They're not talking about social innovation. They're not talking about environmental innovation. They're not talking, when I say social innovation, they're not talking about things like, how about cooperative models that encourage cooperation over competition? So we actually are starting to hear, I have an interview, I didn't manage to get it done before I left for Chicago, but I have an interview scheduled for next week with somebody who's actually behind trying to start an agricultural data co-op in Ontario to have people collectively decide what kind of data we need to collect and what do we want to do with it and who will have access to it. So to think about social innovation and environmental innovations, so things like agroecological approaches to growing food rather than more technology. Opt-in technologies is something that the former Information and Privacy Commissioner for Ontario, Dr. Anne Kavokian, described as privacy by design. She outlined 7 principles that would actually allow us to really put privacy at the front of technological innovation. Algorithmic transparency, I don't need to talk about it because Clifford already talked about this earlier, the black box, removing the black box and being transparent about how these algorithms are designed and what they do with our data. And investing in public research and research in the public interest, I think, is the key thing. I think for us to advocate and push for this is an essential part of what we should be really thinking about in terms of agriculture and food data, but also other data. So data co-ops example, again, is great. And I think we also have a couple of really great examples of where things have been done right. So I'm going to close on a couple of examples. So this is the Agri-Climate Impact Reporter. This is a federal government initiative in Canada where farmers voluntarily post information on weather and climate events and how they affect farms, but they also have access to this information. So this is all open access. Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs is looking at soil data, and what they're trying to do is not necessarily make it all open access because of privacy concerns, but to make aggregate data still available to the farmers who are willing to put up soil information into these repositories. So I think there's some promising developments. They're still playing a pretty small role in this field, but I'm going to close on that because I'm out of time, and make sure that I have a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
That was excellent. My name's Georgie. I work in Virginia. And my private life is all about biodynamic agriculture and farming. And if you want a lot of data, the biodynamic farmers have it because it's all about data and recording and observation. But the farmers that my husband works with and that I get to meet because of his work, they do not have access to internet regularly, and they do not have any time to submit data. So can you talk about strategies to collect data from small farmers that's excellent data that involves them not writing or having to log on to a computer every day?
That's actually, I really, really like that question for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that, and given the audience, I think this will be well received, but I think that community libraries continue to play a really, really important role in particularly rural communities, not only because of access to the internet, but just in terms of really connecting people and being able to serve as places where information can be gathered. I worked, I'll give you this as an example, and I don't know how this would work in your community or any other community where biodynamic farmers might be operating, but I worked on Pelee Island, which is a small island in the middle of Lake Erie, and one of the things that we used to do is actually, I worked at a museum, but we had this book where people could come in and record depending on what we were trying to track. So wild turkeys were reintroduced to the island. So we're trying to track the populations of wild turkeys, and people could just come in and write their information down or bring a sheet of paper where they recorded where they observed on their property, and then we would record that into a book. So I think that, you know, these are things that, of course, it would increase the workload for community libraries, but I think it's something that many librarians would be willing to do off the side of their desks, as you know, we did at the museum, because we know that this is important information. So I think, you know, we focus so much on global aggregation of information, but gathering information at a local level, I think, is really critical. And, you know, one of the things that I also want to point out is that I think the example you're giving is, again, an example of where we have private but also increasingly public research and innovation investment being directed to these technologies that are only serving a particular demographic among farm communities. So many people are actually being left behind, and the concern about this is that, you know, it's okay, it's not just about them not being competitive. It's okay to not be competitive, because if your goal was to compete with Monsanto, you wouldn't be a biodynamic farmer, right? So that's okay, but it's about where we're actually putting public resources into what kind of agricultural development. And I think that by being left behind in these data developments, we're really risking many forms of farming to remain underfunded and undersupported and really undermined in many ways. I hope that answers it. Thank you.
I'm Pat Reeks from the University of Florida, and I'm not sure I have a question, but hearing your talk makes me feel a lot better as a land-grant institution, how heavily engaged we are in public research through our Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, and the fact that we are developing and creating research that's publicly available, and the role that the libraries play at UF in support of that mission.
I'm glad to hear that, because I think, you know, you should also be concerned with this, because the more technology and data is available through these big conglomerates, the less relevance governments are going to see in institutions like yours. But kudos to you, and keep doing the good work.
Just a quick comment. I noticed one of your slides had Archer Daniels Midland at the top of that, and I couldn't help but think about that movie that Matt Damon was in a few years ago that reflected on the price fixing that Archer Daniels Midland was in the middle of. And that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And although every evil isn't intentionally evil, when you have large actors like this, it sure shows how you're able to multiply harms and spread harms over a broad area, whether intended or not.
And, you know, to just kind of refer back to what Julie was saying earlier, sorry, I had my timer set here wrongly, so it's just going off now. What Julie was saying earlier, and just to have conglomerates that have that much control, like Julie mentioned earlier about Google Earth and what a valuable source of information that is, but what if Google just decides to shut it down tomorrow? So that just sense of control over that level of information is, I think, pretty scary. Thank you. Anybody else? No?
Hi, I'm John Slocum. I'm a consultant and a fellow with Chicago Council on Global Relations, or Chicago Council on Global Affairs, old name. You led off with the chart on the consolidation of the seed industry, and is it more than a provocative analogy to see the enclosure of the genetic commons alongside the closure of data and other types of commons that the CRL is interested in?
Is it more than just, I mean, these are trends. I use Phil Howard's map because he's done such an incredible job of visualizing many of the sectors. But this has been a concern, I would say, well, since the 80s. And particularly after the 90s, the World Trade Organization and the international trade agreements that have taken place since. It's really not just about saying, oh, look at how much, you know, concentration there's going on in seed. It's this really intertwined relationship between agricultural products, in the case of Monsanto, for instance, and Syngenta and Dow DuPont. Now, agricultural data, so they're coming into the information markets, the crossover with financial markets. So what we're seeing really with, you know, with companies that are now starting to look at, let's buy big swaths of land and we'll sell these as good investments to people, and we'll just buy more and more and more. So it's not just a provocation. I think it's a really serious concern, and I know that some of these companies have developed really good technologies. I'm not a Luddite. I think there's a lot of potential in some of the technologies we're dealing with, but I do believe there's a better way of doing it. Does that answer your question? Yeah?